My name's Dan Seghetti. Obviously work at Trend Micro. I'm a cloud solutions engineer there. Been around for about 4.5 years with Trend at this point. Prior to that, I worked at a small audiobook company called Audible, where I assisted with technical operations, system administration, things like that. So I have a very mixed background. Worked at a startup before that. Did pretty much anything you can think of, between developing web apps for our salespeople to like I said, systems administration, right? And security, right? That was back in those days, like pre 2010. But I'm going to cover, like Ron mentioned, cloud compliance with financial service in mind. We do have, between Casey and I, we did have like customers that were in the financial industry, right? Like banks, organizations such as that, as well as a couple of the consulting firms that provide solutions to those banks, right? So we have a lot of exposure to the financial industry, and provide a lot of value when it comes down to identifying some of those risks in the cloud. So just to introduce the problem topic, right? To like what we're talking about here in level set. A lot of our organizations are moving to AWS, Azure, GCP, cloud in general. Most of my customers at this point are somewhere in between, right? They lie in the hybrid cloud scenario, where they have I'd say about 80% of my customers are probably there, where they have like some form of data center, on-premise network that they're still maintaining, endpoints, databases, things of that nature in their on-prem data centers, and then endpoints, user laptops, workstations, things of that nature. And then obviously there's this new entire vector that we've introduced to the market, right, which is cloud. One of the things I say at reInvent is that, it was never easier, at least the early reInvents, it's never easier to just sign up for infrastructure with a credit card, right? All you need is this kind of an AWS account is a credit card. So that introduces a whole new plane of risk to our environment and to our organizations, right? And one of the things when I started with Audible and with the startup before that, AWS was this new kind of ecosystem baby, right? You started to use S3. We're like, hey, we don't really need to use the NAS device anymore. We can just use S3. But for the permissions on it, I couldn't tell you. I don't remember, don't recall, but I'm pretty sure it was definitely open to the internet. As long as you had the endpoint URL, you were good to go, right? That would not fly now, right? There are so many vectors of places for folks to be able to go and grab information and utilize public facing services to manipulate permissions, things like that. So that's the baseline, right? We're trying to make sure that that plane that we've added onto our ecosystem is secure and is as up to date, as up to snuff as possible. And like Ron mentioned actually earlier, there are always new compliance regulations that are coming out, especially from the EU, but from the US as well, as to how cloud configurations should be met, right? And these are broad language. This is broad language that says you should be, rotating your keys every 6 months. You should be perhaps making sure that users can't do invalid travel, right? Like where they can log into the US and then within 10 seconds log in from China, for example, right? It doesn't make any sense. So all these new like misconfigurations that are being introduced and regulatory pieces that are being introduced are forcing our customer bases to pretty much say, hey, how can we identify these misconfigurations, vulnerabilities quickly, if they already exist? And then how can we prevent those from being deployed in the first place? That's kind of where we kind of sit in as far as the problem is concerned. Any questions so far?
Nothing right now, but I still am ready to buy $10 gift cards for people.
Yeah, you guys got to jump on the $10 gift card train. I have two more slides, and then we'll jump right into the demo. So just to address like the problem statement that I addressed earlier, right? So how are we kind of looking at this? Basically, what Trend Micro does is we have attack surface risk management. We take that plane of the cloud and we also attach every other plane that we mentioned earlier: email, endpoint, data center, you name it. And we try to identify things like vulnerabilities, misconfigurations, things of that nature that would be that would inhibit us from meeting the criteria that we're trying to hit, right? Like CIS benchmarks, well-architected framework reports, things like that. When it comes down to the nitty-gritty, what we're doing with cloud posture, which is part of the ASRM piece, is we're looking specifically drilling into those AWS accounts, those Azure accounts, the GCP accounts, and comparing the configurations that are in them to a rule database that we create, right? Our customers give us live feedback for those rules. They say, hey, we need to, we're a major multimedia company, or in our case, we're a major bank, and we need to adhere to some FDIC regulation, SOC 2, PCI, you name it, right? There's a new version of PCI that's just came out, and it has new verbiage for this section. What we do from there is say, okay, Mr. Bank, we are going to investigate this new verbiage, and we're going to either create new rules for all the new services inside AWS and those cloud services that we just mentioned, right? Or we're going to map our existing rules to those specific new requirements, right? From there, basically what happens from a technical perspective, an API call goes out. It says, hey, let's check all the different rules for as far as permissions go for our resources that we're pulling for, right? Like EC2s, EBS volumes, databases, network configurations, you name it, AWS, we have a rule for it, right? Including AWS native security services, whether or not your guard duty is enabled, things like that, and how you should have it enabled. So not agnostic to any of those types of things, right? We're truly trying to help build your AWS account to its maximum potential of reaching things like those CIS benchmarks, things of that nature. The second half, I'd say, is when you connect and you start running that API, it's called the conformity bot. It's going to reach out, try to grab some of the configurations, compare it to our rule database. But there's the more proactive piece of this, and I talked about this over at Secure World a couple of weeks ago in Philadelphia, where you could be proactive or reactive, right? And proactive is saying, well, as we mature as cloud organizations, we're going to end up stopping the deployment through manual pieces, right? We're not going to be cutting tickets to an infrastructure engineer to go set up our S3 bucket. Our infrastructure engineer is going to press a button, and then an S3 bucket is going to appear, right? It's going to go through a pipeline, meet our requirements. That's kind of like the guardrails of becoming a more mature organization. So when those start coming up, when that starts coming up, we're starting to use IAC. So we can become more preventative. We can say, hey, why don't we check that CloudFormation template for S3 best practices before it gets deployed. So when we incorporate ourselves into a pipeline, I can name like 3 or 4 different financial firms who have come to exactly Casey and I and said, hey, we don't use the AWS GUI. We don't even use the CLI like from our desktops. We don't have like user roles from that perspective. We have a Jenkins pipeline that does this deployment. We have a code pipeline in AWS that does this deployment. So your tool needs to be able to be deployed through this pipeline. So not only are we able to be deployed to the pipeline, we can enable our customers and your customers, or if you're an organization that's looking for it, to check against those configurations before they get deployed. And I'm just going to skip my last slide and we'll just jump right into the demo because I talk too much. Let me stop my share and I'll reshare in 1 second here. Beautiful. So this is attack surface risk management. We're going to bump right over to our cloud posture piece here. So right off the bat, you can see a couple of things. I have 2 AWS accounts connected to cloud posture, any demos and TM workshop. I can add groups as well as add other accounts, whether non-agnostic to just AWS. You can add Azure accounts, you could add GCP accounts, wherever you happen to be doing cloud. We're doing business alongside them. Alibaba and the et ceteras are coming down the line. I know that's probably a question that somebody might have earned $10 for, but it is on its way, right? As those become more popular. But this is a dashboard, and I always say, this is the first thing that you see, and this is kind of the quick bite. Most folks will probably look at this the first time they buy our product, and if I were an administrator, I would probably have this in my NOC somewhere, just standing out in the corner and looking at this, refreshing every 10, 15 minutes, right? That's about the extent of how I would use the dashboard. But what you can do with this, and what I would say is a really good quick use case when it comes to organizations out there that probably haven't used Trend Micro before or have limited interactions with Trend Micro. One of the best things that I've done with my new logo or new greenfield customers is connect conformity, even if it's just a 30-day trial. And if you're looking to adhere to a standard or framework, you can connect this, run the API, grab the configuration or the standard or framework that you're trying to meet. Like, let's say you're trying to meet CIS controls version 8, ISO 2701, like we're trying to become a really secure organization, ISO 2701, PCI DSS v4, right? There's a few others in there as well, NIST and things like that. But what I can do is, let's say I want to do PCI. I process credit card data inside of AWS. I can go into here, filter down the checks. Let's say I'm not really too concerned. As a security engineer, I'm not too concerned about the OE, the cost optimization, the operational excellence. I'm mostly concerned about security, or maybe reliability as well. You can drop those pillars in and out of your search criteria. And I only really am concerned about our failures, right? I don't need to see every single resource that I have in AWS and whether or not it adheres to it. I want to see which ones don't. I'd come down here and you're going to see inside of conformity inside this dashboard, you can look at the PCI report, right? The verbiage of the PCI report, the sections of that PCI report, and delineate what inside of your ecosystem needs to be changed in order to become completely compliant with PCI, right? So in this situation, I'm looking at things like security group alarms, VPC changes alarms, looking at some notifications, VPC flow logs being enabled. We're going to look at all the different VPCs that don't have flow logs enabled. And these, like I said, these are all mapped to the well-architected framework as well as the compliance threshold that you're trying to meet, like PCI. What I will also mention is that, let's say, unrestricted RDP access is in one of these security groups. That's a really bad one. But for some reason, I don't know, we're running in a dev environment or a QA environment, and we don't really care too much about unrestricted RDP access to these clusters for some reason. We can go in, configure the rule to allow certain pieces to allow that unrestricted RDP access. We could suppress that check. Let's say I want to suppress it for 90 days. 1/4 is what I give my folks, is how much I'm giving these folks access to unrestricted RDP access. I'll put a trouble ticket, that's an Amazon term if anybody's from there, but I'll put a ticket in for the notes here and suppress the check. One thing I would be remiss to not mention is that every single rule also has a knowledge base associated with it, right? So this is the human component of this and what really differentiates us when it comes to CSPMs across the broader market, right? Every single record of our rule has a knowledge base associated with it. So it'll show you what other frameworks would adhere to this kind of rule finding, as well as how to audit for it yourself, and then how to remediate it. One of my favorite things to do, there's actually a financial organization that does this, is they bring in their summer interns every year. They have their conformity set up and they run kind of like Netflix's Chaos Monkey inside of an AWS account, right? They absolutely just hammer an AWS account, misconfigure it, hand it to their security interns and say, go fix it. They hook in conformity and they utilize the tool to actually go find the misconfigurations and use the knowledge base here to write out in the ticket what they would use to remediate the action, but keep the functionality of the app that they've built, right? So that's a big piece there.
One thing to mention, Dan, if you want to go back there real quick,
yep,
is those scripts you were showing you aren't just cookie cutter. When you dig into a particular resource, it's going to be customized for that resource and for that fix. So if you have a VPC that you need to remediate, that VPC is linked directly in that code. So when you run that script, it's talking about that VPC. Or when it calls something out, you can directly link to those individual resources that are acting out. And yeah, as you can see, linked resources, right? If Dan was logged in, he could just click it and it would load that particular resource. This is especially important. You know, we have customers that have not just one or two accounts, Azure, GCP, or AWS, but they have hundreds of each. And this can aggregate those hundreds of accounts into these reports. And then you won't get lost in the sea of, okay, well, which account is it that I have this violation in? And, you know, that will take your time to remediation from, yeah, there's an alert, let me go find it, to there's an alert, here's the exact resource that's in real time out of line. And not only that, can your human come in here and learn how to remediate this, whether they're up to snuff or not with that particular knowledge and how to remediate them in their cloud environment. But it'll also open up a trouble ticket for you automatically, send all of that pertinent data that Dan was just showing you right in that trouble ticket. And then your hands and feet team has an exact script as to how to fix the thing that they're being told to fix, instead of just wondering if it's the right thing or not, right? And then this is going to reduce issues in perhaps taking down production, right? They change those quad zeros back out of that security group in the wrong security group. Suddenly, your production's down, and then you've made a bad problem worse.
Right. Absolutely. And yeah, thanks for that, Casey. One last thing, I'll say two more things and then open it up for questions. One of the best things that my most successful conformity customers, I should say, cloud posture customers are doing is when you view all these checks, these kind of queries can be configured down to actually also enable you to do communications, right? So let's say, for example, I'm thinking of a like top of mind customer here. One of them has basically this query set up. I'm looking for security findings, any framework, but I'm looking for extreme, very high and high security findings. I have 3 applications that our customers or our organization handles, and all of them are tagged. All the resources are automatically tagged when we deploy them. So they do, tag 1, team 1, right? Something of that nature. So every resource that has a tag and a team associated with it, what they did is they basically generated a communications channel so that, let's say they want to do email notifications. They can email notification themselves for that. And they can also email notification the team that's responsible, so the PMs that are responsible. Or maybe they have a ticket queue. So they want to pass the responsibility of making this great security architecture off of their team, but onto the actual product owners themselves. So that's one of the best use cases that I've seen when it comes to like the cloud posture tool, is taking advantage of the query and the access that we have inside of the AWS account, and then communicating that out towards the organization itself. Like I said, this is a great dashboard to have up in your NOC somewhere, but it's even more powerful when it becomes a day-to-day task. It becomes part of the day-to-day task of your engineers in the organization. And then the last piece is that we also have the template scanner out here as well. And this can be configured in your IDEs. So if you have, like, let's say VS Code, you can hook this in, and basically what would happen is you'd be able to scan your CloudFormation templates before you deploy them, find those misconfigurations before. You can also incorporate that into your CI/CD pipeline as a step. Say, hey, scan this pipe, scan this IAC template, and then decide what you want to do with it, right? Do you just pass the logs back to the person that deployed it yourself? Or do you want to stop the build and inform someone that there's a misconfiguration there? So both proactive and reactive ways to use conformity there for financial cloud stuff there.
Hey, Dan.
Yep.
John, who's one of the senior IT auditors with the University of Maryland system, had a question. I'm going to I'm going to allow John to talk. John, I could summarize your question, but maybe you could share it directly with everyone.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Hi, how's it going? I was trying to help the participation. Yeah. So, but anyway, so I will say that I'm an auditor, and so a lot of this stuff is kind of hard for me to imagine how I can use it in my day-to-day job, but I was trying to see if there's a potential. A lot of times we like to audit against a standard like NIST or something like that when we're doing on our audits. We audit all of the Maryland universities, and we'll look at a standard like NIST or something like that. And I was wondering, this seemed like it was a cloud application auditing tool. But basically, I was wondering if it could be used on the fly in some way as an auditor, or if you need to have an agent relationship where you have this long-term relationship, where it's constantly monitoring.
That's a good question. So what I would envision for you guys is that I'm imagining the universities probably come to you for the auditing, or you go to them for the auditing, depending on the state regulations, things like that, right? Like a forced relationship.
Yes.
To an extent. This could be a tool in your toolbox, or the universities themselves, if they're not using it, you can come in with your own tool and say, Mr. University, we use this tool. It's a very simple read-only role that enables us to do our security findings at much faster rate with less, this might have my sales hat on right now, but with less interaction with your direct teams, right? Because you won't you'll see AWS configurations that are in there and you might need to validate with them, but that's one less step of saying, hey, I need to go in and validate that this configuration is the way it is, right? The configuration of the AWS services are right there in front of you. And you can just go in and say, hey, why is this configured like this? Not if it's configured like that. It does require a step to deploy that role into their AWS accounts, right? But it's definitely something that can be used on the fly. I know Casey has some
Okay.
thoughts.
Yeah, and it's only a read-only role from an AWS, GCP, Azure perspective, right? So there's no interfering with production whatsoever when you interface with this. In fact, I'm going to put the link in the chat because I know we're running out of time and we had a slide too. But there's a form there that you can actually, anybody here can use to sign up. We'll scan you for free. We'll measure you against any of the compliance frameworks, what have you, just show you where your environment sits compared to roughly industry best practice. And then there's a number of other actual scans that we can do, both agent and not agent based, that we're happy to sit down with you and give you a snapshot of where your organization sits. And if you do this by November 10th and sign up, we're giving away a DJI Mini SE drone, which is a favorite toy of mine. So whether you're in it for the drone or not, doesn't bother me. But frankly, the scans are easy to set up. We do not make a habit of breaking production ever. So everybody goes in with eyes open, and a lot of these things are very external facing, or in the case of conformity, it's just a read-only role where we can't break anything. So it's very, very safe to run in your environments. And you can see exactly where you stand and when. And to your point, you can use it intermittently or you can use it constantly. It doesn't matter.